If you believe one small act of kindness can change a life, pause for a second, tap the like button, and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this remind us why humanity still matters. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about a birthday dinner, it's about dignity, loss, and how one ordinary person can quietly become someone's miracle. 80 candles. That's what Margaret had imagined while buttoning her faded blue coat in the small mirror of her apartment. 80 years of life, of surviving wars she only heard about on the radio, of raising children who now lived far away, of learning how to eat dinner alone without letting the silence hurt too much. This birthday was special to her. Not because of gifts or cake, but because she had decided, after years of staying home, that she would go out. Just once. Just for this milestone. She chose a modest but well-known restaurant downtown, the kind that advertised family warmth in its windows. She even practiced what she would say to the hostess, worried her voice might shake. The restaurant was buzzing when she arrived. Laughter spilled out the door, glasses clinked, and the smell of warm bread wrapped around her like a memory. Margaret stepped inside carefully, holding her purse with both hands. She smiled at the young hostess and softly said it was her birthday and she was hoping for a small table. The hostess glanced at her, then at the crowded room, then back again with a polite but distant expression. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "We're fully booked. And we don't usually seat single diners during peak hours." The words landed heavier than they should have. Fully booked. Single diners. Margaret nodded quickly, embarrassed, as if she had broken some rule she didn't know existed. She tried to explain it was her birthday, that she wouldn't take long, that she'd sit anywhere, but the hostess was already turning to the next group behind her. A young couple brushed past, laughing, and Margaret felt herself shrinking, invisible. Her throat tightened. She whispered thank you even though she hadn't been helped, and slowly turned toward the door. Outside, the evening air was colder than before. The restaurant lights glowed warmly behind the glass, but to Margaret they felt like something she was no longer allowed to touch. She walked to a nearby bench and sat down, her shoulders slumping. She told herself she was too old to cry over something so small, yet tears slipped down anyway. It wasn't about the table. It was about feeling like you no longer belonged anywhere. At that same moment, inside the restaurant, Daniel was struggling to keep his 5-year-old son from sliding under the table. His daughter, just 7, was drawing hearts on a napkin and asking loudly when the food would come. Daniel was tired, bone-tired. A single father for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed away unexpectedly, he had learned how to juggle work, homework, grief, and bedtime stories. Tonight was supposed to be a small treat for the kids after a hard week. But as he tried to smile at them, he noticed something through the window. An elderly woman sitting alone on a bench, wiping her eyes. Daniel watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. Something about the way she held herself, so careful, so fragile, felt familiar. It reminded him of his own mother, who lived in another city and often said she didn't want to be a burden. Without fully thinking it through, Daniel stood up. The kids protested, but he told them to stay put and walked toward the hostess. "Excuse me," he said, pointing outside. "That woman, why did she leave?" The hostess hesitated, then shrugged. "She was alone. We're really busy tonight." Daniel frowned. "It's her birthday," he said, though he didn't know why he was so sure. "And there's an empty chair at my table." The hostess looked uncertain, but something in Daniel's tone made her pause. After a brief silence, she nodded. "All right. But she'll have to join your table." Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed a menu and hurried outside before the courage left him. Margaret looked up, startled, as a stranger approached. Daniel smiled warmly and said, "Ma'am, I don't want to intrude, but I heard it's your birthday. Would you like to have dinner with us?" For a second, Margaret thought she'd misheard. "With you?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "My kids and I. There's plenty of room." Her first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to inconvenience anyone. She didn't want to feel pitied. But then she looked at his eyes, kind, tired, sincere, and something in her chest loosened. She nodded slowly. "If you're sure." Daniel offered his arm, and together they walked back inside. When Margaret sat at the table, the children stared at her with open curiosity. "It's her birthday," the little girl announced. "She's 80. Margaret laughed, surprised at herself, and the sound felt rusty but good. The kids immediately started asking questions. Did she have pets? What was school like when she was little? Did she know dinosaurs weren't real? Margaret answered each one, her voice growing stronger with every sentence. As food arrived, the table filled with stories. Margaret talked about meeting her husband at a bus stop when she was 19, about dancing in the kitchen while the radio played, about losing him too soon and learning how quiet a house can be. Daniel shared pieces of his own life, not the details, but enough. The kids listened, sometimes interrupting, sometimes just eating happily. Something gentle and unexpected settled over the table. It didn't feel like strangers anymore. It felt like family, if only for one night. When dessert came, Daniel quietly asked the waiter for a small cake. 80 candles would have been too much, so they lit one. The kids sang loudly and off-key, and Margaret closed her eyes before blowing out the flame. She didn't wish for more years. She wished that no one would ever feel as alone as she had felt an hour earlier. At the end of the meal, Margaret reached for her purse, but Daniel stopped her. "Please," he said. "Let us." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were warm. She squeezed his hand. "You gave me more than dinner," she whispered. "You gave me a memory." Outside, as they said goodbye, the kids hugged her like they'd known her forever. Margaret walked home lighter than she had in years. And Daniel returned to his car with his children quieter than usual, each one thinking in their own small way. That night, as he tucked them into bed, his daughter asked, "Can we invite lonely people to dinner again?" Daniel smiled and said, "Yes. We can always try." Somewhere in the city, Margaret placed a photo from that evening on her bedside table. Not because it was perfect, but because it reminded her that kindness can arrive when you least expect it, sometimes through a denied table, sometimes through a single father who simply chose to care. If this story touched your heart even a little, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might need to hear a story like this today, and who you might inspire to change everything with one small act. Before this story begins, do me a small favor. If you believe kindness still matters in a world that often forgets, like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are. Now listen closely, because this birthday almost ended in silence until one unexpected choice changed everything. Eleanor hadn't celebrated her birthday in 11 years. Not since her husband's chair at the table stayed empty longer than it should have. But turning 80 felt different. It felt heavy. Like a chapter that deserved to be acknowledged, even if no one else noticed. That morning, she pressed her best dress, the one with small white buttons and a soft lavender scarf, and whispered to her reflection, "Just one nice meal." She didn't want a party. She didn't want attention. She just didn't want to eat alone again. The restaurant she chose wasn't fancy, but it was warm. The kind of place families went on special nights. As Eleanor stepped inside, the sound of laughter washed over her. For a moment, she felt young again. She approached the hostess, her hands trembling slightly as she smiled. "Good evening, dear," she said. "It's my birthday. I was hoping for a small table, just for me." The hostess barely looked up. Her eyes flicked from Eleanor's worn shoes to the packed dining room. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. "We don't seat single guests during dinner rush. You'll need a reservation or a party." Eleanor blinked. "Oh," she said softly. "I see." She waited, hoping for kindness to follow. It didn't. The hostess turned away. Eleanor stood there longer than she should have, feeling foolish, invisible. Then she nodded politely, the way people do when they're trying not to cry, and walked back out into the cold evening. She sat on a bench across the street, the glow of the restaurant mocking her through the window. 80 years old, and this was how the day ended. She told herself she shouldn't be surprised. The world moves fast. It doesn't wait for the old. Inside the restaurant, Michael was negotiating peace with his two kids. A spilled drink, a missing fork, questions flying non-stop. Being a single father wasn't what he'd imagined life would look like at 36, but here he was, doing his best since his wife passed away 2 years earlier. He loved his children fiercely, but some nights exhaustion lived in his bones. As he looked up to signal the waiter, his eyes caught something outside. An elderly woman. Sitting alone. Crying quietly. Michael couldn't look away. Something about her posture, the way she folded in on herself, felt painfully familiar. He remembered his own mother sitting alone after his father died, pretending she was fine. Without asking himself why, Michael stood up. He walked to Th.